Sarah's expression grew grave. Then we'll face the same fate as Margaret and all the others who've tried to stand against them over the years. But if we don't try, the consequences will be far worse than anything the Circle has attempted before. I looked down at Whitmore's map, still glowing faintly with residual energy from the communication with the Wise Ones. The document had guided me to this moment, bringing me to Salem and putting me in contact with the people and knowledge I needed to make an informed decision, but the choice itself was still mine to make. "All right," I said finally. "Show me how to implement the third path." Chapter 6. The Network Awakens. The rest of that day was spent in intensive training as Sarah introduced me to knowledge that her family had been preserving for generations. We returned to her house, a colonial-era building that had been modified over the centuries to serve as both residence and repository for third path materials. The basement contained what amounted to a secret library shelves lined with documents in multiple languages, artifacts from various cultures that had developed methods for managing interdimensional contact, and modern equipment that had been adapted for supernatural research purposes. "The third path isn't just Ephraim's creation," Sarah explained as she pulled books and papers from various shelves. "It's a synthesis of techniques developed by indigenous peoples around the world, combined with advances in European natural philosophy and updated with modern scientific understanding." She showed me manuscripts from Tibetan monasteries that described methods for communicating with beings from the spaces between thoughts, records from Aboriginal Australian cultures that detailed protocols for safely traversing dimensional boundaries during dreamtime journeys, documents from African traditions that explained how to distinguish between helpful and harmful otherworldly entities. "Every human culture has legends about contact with beings from other realms," Sarah continued. "Most modern people dismiss these as primitive superstitions, but Ephraim realized that they were actually sophisticated technologies for managing interdimensional relationships. The technical aspects of the third path were far more complex than anything I'd encountered in my previous work with antique maps. Instead of simple cartographic binding, the system required what Sarah called dynamic dimensional management, the ability to adjust the permeability of reality barriers in real time based on changing conditions and specific communication needs. The key is understanding that consciousness itself is a form of energy that can exist independently of physical matter," she explained, spreading out diagrams that showed the theoretical framework underlying the entire system. "The Wise Ones exist primarily as consciousness, but they can temporarily manifest in our dimension when provided with an appropriate interface, and that interface is the cartographer. Not just any cartographer, someone who can maintain simultaneous awareness of multiple dimensional states while serving as a communication bridge between different types of consciousness. It requires a combination of technical skill, psychic sensitivity, and what Ephraim called moral clarity. The moral clarity component was particularly important, according to Sarah's explanation. The third path involved opening controlled access points between dimensions, which created opportunities for both beneficial and harmful entities to attempt contact. The bridge walker had to be able to distinguish between the two and maintain barriers against malevolent influences while facilitating communication with helpful beings. That's where most previous attempts at interdimensional contact have failed, Sarah noted. People either maintain such rigid barriers that they prevent all contact, or they're so eager for otherworldly knowledge that they don't adequately screen the entities they're communicating with. She pulled out a case study that documented a 1950s research project conducted by the Soviet Union. The researchers had successfully established contact with otherworldly entities, but had failed to recognize that the beings they were communicating with were deliberately providing false information designed to advance their own agenda for interdimensional expansion. The project ended when the entities began manifesting physically in Moscow and attempting to replace key government officials with dimensional duplicates, Sarah said. The entire research team had to be eliminated, and the facility was destroyed with nuclear weapons. The afternoon was spent learning the theoretical foundations of the third path, but by evening, Sarah began teaching me the practical techniques I would need to implement the system. This involved a combination of meditation practices adapted from various mystical traditions, mathematical formulations that described the geometry of interdimensional space, and specific procedures for activating and controlling the modified seal network. The most important thing to remember is that you're not working alone, she emphasized as we practiced basic communication protocols. The wise ones will be guiding and supporting you throughout the process, but they can only act through your conscious choices and deliberate actions. As night fell, we began the first phase of actual implementation. According to Sarah's plan, we needed to visit each of the 13 seal locations and establish preliminary contact with the wise ones, creating a network of communication points that could be fully activated once all the sites were prepared. We started with a location closest to her house's seal, positioned beneath what was now the Salem Public Library. The building had been constructed in 1889, but according to Whitmore's map, the site had been significant long before European settlement. The library was closed for the evening, but Sarah produced keys that gave us access to the basement storage areas. As we descended into the building's lower levels, I could feel the familiar warmth and electromagnetic activity that marked supernatural sites. The original Abenaki ceremonial site was located directly beneath where we're standing now, Sarah explained, leading me through corridors lined with archived books and historical documents. Ephraim incorporated their anchor points into his seal network, which is why the third path can build on existing infrastructure. We reached a storage room that looked completely ordinary except for the temperature was at least 20 degrees, warmer than the rest of the basement, despite having no heating equipment or obvious sources of heat generation. Sarah pulled out a floor plan of the building and compared it to markings on Whitmore's map. The access point is behind that shelving unit, she said, indicating a wall-mounted bookcase that held boxes of archived materials, working together. We moved the shelving aside to reveal a section of stone wall that was clearly much older than the rest of the building. Carved into the ancient blocks were symbols that matched those I'd seen on the monument in the cemetery, along with newer additions that bore Ephraim's distinctive style. Place your hand on the central symbol and open your mind to communication, Sarah instructed. But remember, you're looking specifically for contact with the wise ones, not just any otherworldly entity that might be listening. I approached the carved wall and placed my palm against the central symbol, trying to empty my mind of preconceptions and expectations while remaining alert to potentially harmful influences. The response was immediate but subtle, not the overwhelming knowledge transfer I'd experienced when touching the monument at the first seal location, but a gentle presence that felt both ancient and completely benign. Images began to form in my consciousness, Salem as it had been centuries before European contact, with structures that looked like a blend of natural and architectural forms, beings that appeared humanoid but were clearly not human, working alongside Abenaki shamans to maintain what looked like a complex system of interdimensional gateways. The communication wasn't verbal, but conceptual direct transfer of understanding that bypassed language entirely. I learned that the wise ones were refugees from a dimension that had been corrupted by entities similar to those the Obsidian Circle was trying to contact. They had been seeking alliance with human cultures that could help them establish stable refuges in worlds that hadn't yet been compromised. The Abenaki had been their first successful partners, developing protocols that allowed beneficial exchange while maintaining protection against malevolent influences. But European colonization had disrupted those traditional safeguards, forcing the wise ones to withdraw from most contact until new partnerships could be established. Ephraim Whitmore had been their second major human ally, but his disappearance had interrupted the development of updated protocols adapted to European culture and technology. For 3 centuries, they had been waiting for conditions to become favorable for resuming the alliance. Now, with malevolent entities mounting increasingly aggressive attempts to establish footholds in our dimension, the need for renewed partnership had become urgent. The wise ones were offering their knowledge and assistance in exchange for help in preventing otherworldly corruption from spreading to additional worlds. As the communication continued, I began to understand the true scope of what was at stake. Salem wasn't just a local problem, it was part of a much larger conflict between different types of otherworldly entities competing for access to and influence over human civilization. The Obsidian Circle, whether they realized it or not, was serving as a proxy force for entities that viewed humanity as raw material for their own expansion and transformation projects. Their offer of knowledge and power came with strings attached that would ultimately result in the loss of human autonomy and identity. But the wise ones represented a different approach to interdimensional contact partnership rather than exploitation, mutual benefit rather than parasitic dependence. They were offering to help humanity develop its own interdimensional capabilities without compromising human independence or forcing unwanted transformations. The choice wasn't just between defensive isolation and risky contact, it was between 2 fundamentally different visions of humanity's relationship with otherworldly forces. As the communication session ended, I found myself with a much clearer understanding of what the third path was designed to accomplish. It wasn't just a technical system for managing dimensional barriers. It was a diplomatic framework for establishing stable, beneficial relationships with otherworldly allies while maintaining protection against hostile entities. How did it feel? Sarah asked as I removed my hand from the carved symbols. Like talking to very old, very patient teachers, I replied. They're not trying to control or manipulate. They're genuinely interested in helping us solve problems and develop capabilities we didn't know were possible. That's the difference between the wise ones and the entities the Circle wants to contact, Sarah explained. The wise ones have spent millions of years learning to coexist peacefully with other forms of consciousness. The beings the Circle is attracted to are essentially interdimensional predators that view other conscious beings as resources to be consumed or converted. We spent the next several hours visiting 3 more SEAL locations, establishing preliminary contact at each site, and gradually building the communication network that would support full implementation of the third path. Each location provided additional pieces of the overall picture, showing me different aspects of the Wise One's capabilities and the nature of the threats they were offering to help counter. By dawn, I had a much better understanding of what I was being asked to do, and what the likely consequences would be for both success and failure. The choice was no longer between unknown alternatives. It was between clearly defined paths with predictable outcomes. The Obsidian Circle's approach would provide immediate access to powerful otherworldly technologies, but at the cost of human autonomy and eventual transformation into something that was no longer recognizably human. The traditional Watcher approach would maintain defensive barriers, but at the cost of isolation from potentially beneficial otherworldly relationships and eventual failure as hostile entities found ways around increasingly inadequate defenses. The third path offered a middle ground that preserved human independence while providing access to otherworldly allies and knowledge. But it required taking on responsibilities and risks that would affect not just Salem, but the broader relationship between humanity and otherworldly consciousness. As we returned to Sarah's house to prepare for the final phases of implementation, I realized that the decision had already been made. The question wasn't whether to proceed with the third path, was whether I could successfully complete the process before the Obsidian Circle's plans reached the point where they couldn't be reversed. "How much time do we have left?" I asked, as we reviewed the locations that still needed to be prepared. Sarah checked her watch and consulted a lunar calendar. "About 18 hours until the new moon reaches optimal alignment. The Circle will begin their major summoning ritual around midnight tonight, which means we need to have the third path network fully operational by then. 9 more locations in 18 hours. It sounds impossible, but remember that we're not working alone anymore. Now that you've established preliminary contact, the Wise Ones can provide more direct assistance. The process will accelerate as we activate more nodes in the network." I looked at Whitmore's map, which was now showing active connections between the 4 sites we'd already prepared. Lines of light linked the locations, creating a partial pattern that would eventually encompass all of Salem once the remaining seals were activated. The map was also displaying new information, real-time updates on Obsidian Circle activities throughout the town. I could see concentrations of otherworldly energy at locations that corresponded to their known facilities, along with movement patterns that suggested they were positioning resources for their midnight operation. "They know something has changed," Sarah observed, studying the same data. "Look at how their energy signatures are shifting. They're responding to the third path activations." She was right. The Circle's activities were becoming more focused and urgent, as if they had detected our work and were accelerating their own timeline in response. Will they try to stop us directly? Probably not, with violence that's too risky and would attract unwanted attention. But they might try other forms of interference. Psychic attacks, supernatural harassment, attempts to disrupt our communication with the Wise Ones. As if summoned by her words, my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Blackwood's number. "Don't answer it," Sarah advised. "Anything they want to discuss can wait until we've completed the network." But the phone kept ringing, and after it finally stopped, a text message appeared. "Mr. Ashford, urgent. Developments require immediate consultation. Lives are at stake. Please call as soon as you receive this message." I showed the text to Sarah, who shook her head grimly. Classic manipulation technique. Create a sense of artificial urgency to pressure you into breaking your focus and accepting their agenda. The phone rang again, this time showing a number I didn't recognize. Then again, with yet another unknown number. Within minutes, I was receiving calls and text messages from multiple sources, all claiming urgent need for immediate communication. "They're escalating," Sarah said, powering down both of our phones, "which means we're having an effect they didn't anticipate. We need to accelerate our own schedule and complete the network activation before they can mount an effective countermeasure." Chapter 7: The Final Confrontation. The next several hours passed in a blur of increasingly intense activity as we raced to complete the third path. Network before the Obsidian Circle could implement their competing plans. Each seal location we activated made the next one easier to access, as the Wise Ones were able to provide more direct assistance through the growing communication network. But the Circle was responding aggressively to our progress. As we worked our way through the remaining sites, we encountered escalating levels of interference equipment, malfunctions, psychological pressure, and manifestations of otherworldly entities that were clearly hostile to our activities. The ninth location, positioned beneath Salem's City Hall, was the most heavily defended. As we approached the building, I could feel waves of malevolent energy radiating from the structure, along with a psychic pressure that made it difficult to think clearly. "They've established a blocking field," Sarah explained, pulling out equipment. That looked like a hybrid between a radio receiver and a Geiger counter. The Circle has been using this building as a base of operations for decades. They're not going to let us access their primary anchor point without a fight. The energy readings from her instruments were unlike anything I'd seen at the previous locations. Instead of the warm organic signatures associated with the Wise Ones, the building was radiating cold, mechanical emanations that felt fundamentally hostile to human consciousness. What exactly have they been doing here? Based on Margaret's research, this is where they conduct their major summoning operations. The basement levels have been converted into a sophisticated interdimensional communication facility, with equipment that's been enhanced using technologies provided by their otherworldly contacts. We circled the building, looking for an access point that wasn't heavily protected by the Circle's defenses. Most of the entrances showed energy signatures that suggested sophisticated alarm systems and possibly booby traps designed to incapacitate intruders, but Whitmore's map indicated a secondary access route through the storm drainage system that connected to the building's sub-basement. The tunnels were old enough to predate the Circle's modifications and might provide a way to reach the seal location without triggering their security measures. The storm drain entrance was located in an alley behind the building, hidden beneath a heavy metal grate that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. But when I applied pressure to the locking mechanism, it opened easily, as if someone had recently oiled the hinges and adjusted the locks. "This could be a trap," Sarah warned, as we prepared to descend into the drainage system. "Everything we're doing at this point could be a trap," I replied. "But we don't have time to find alternative approaches. The new moon alignment is only 8 hours away." The tunnels beneath Salem were larger and more extensive than I'd expected, forming a network that connected most of the downtown area and extended well beyond the boundaries shown on modern city maps. Some sections looked like they dated back to the colonial period, while others appeared to have been constructed or modified much more recently. We followed the route indicated on Whitmore's map, using flashlights and Sarah's energy detection equipment to navigate through passages that seemed to shift and change when we weren't paying direct attention. After 20 minutes of increasingly disorienting travel, we reached a junction that matched the location shown on the map. "The seal is directly above us," Sarah said, checking her instruments against the historical document. "But there's something else here too, a much stronger energy signature than we've encountered at the other sites." I looked up at the ceiling of the tunnel and saw that it was covered with carved symbols that weren't shown on Whitmore's map. The designs were more complex and aggressive looking than the protective seals we'd been working with, and they radiated a cold hostility that made my skin crawl. "Obsidian Circle modifications," Sarah identified grimly. They've been using this location as an anchor point for their own summoning network. We're not just trying to activate Ephraim's seal, we're directly confronting their primary operational base. As she spoke, the carved symbols began to glow with a harsh, artificial light that was nothing like the warm phosphorescence of the third path locations. The temperature in the tunnel dropped precipitously, and I could hear sounds coming. Through the stone ceiling, mechanical humming mixed with what might have been chanting or electronic music. They know we're here, I realized. More than that, they're trying to use our presence to anchor whatever they're summoning upstairs. The proximity to an active third-path communication link gives them access to energies they wouldn't normally be able to manipulate. The situation was rapidly becoming untenable. We couldn't complete the seal activation while under direct attack from the Circle's defenses, but we also couldn't retreat without abandoning a critical node in the protective network. Is there any way to disable their modifications without triggering their security systems? Sarah studied the carved symbols more carefully, using her detection equipment to analyze their energy signatures. Maybe, if we can establish contact with the Wise Ones through this location, they might be able to counter the Circle's influence directly. But it would require opening a full communication channel while under active psychic attack. What are the risks if something goes wrong? We could end up providing the Circle with access to the third path network instead of protecting it. They could potentially use our own communication channels to summon hostile entities directly into the Wise One's dimensional space. The sounds from above were getting louder and more urgent, suggesting that the Circle was accelerating their own schedule in response to our presence. We could hear multiple voices chanting in unison, electronic equipment cycling through complex operational patterns, and something that sounded like otherworldly entities attempting to manifest in physical space. We don't have a choice, I decided. If we don't try to counter their operation now, they'll complete their summoning before we can finish activating the protective network. I placed my hand on the central symbol of Whitmore's seal, while Sarah positioned herself to monitor the Circle's modifications and warn me of any dangerous changes in their energy patterns. The contact with the Wise Ones was immediate and much more intense than any of the previous communication sessions. They were clearly aware of the threat posed by the Circle's activities and were prepared to provide maximum assistance despite the risks involved. But I could also sense something else through the connection, the presence of the entities the Circle was trying to summon. They were hostile, aggressive, and extremely powerful, with capabilities that made them genuinely dangerous even to beings as advanced as the Wise Ones. The opposing forces met in the dimensional space that existed between physical reality and otherworldly consciousness. What followed wasn't exactly a battle in any conventional sense, but rather a conflict between different organizing principles of reality itself. The Circle's entities sought to impose their own structure on whatever they contacted, transforming and consuming other forms of consciousness to fuel their continued expansion. The Wise Ones represented stability and cooperation, working to maintain boundaries and facilitate beneficial exchange between different types of beings. I found myself serving as a focal point for the conflict, with both sides attempting to work through my consciousness to effect changes in physical reality. The experience was overwhelming, like being caught in a storm of pure thought and will, buffeted by forces that operated on scales I couldn't fully comprehend. But gradually, I began to understand what was happening. The Circle's summoning ritual was designed to create permanent access points that malevolent entities could use to establish footholds in our dimension. Once those footholds were secured, The entities would begin systematic conversion of human consciousness, transforming people into extensions of their own collective will. The third path offered a different approach-controlled, temporary access that allowed beneficial exchange while maintaining protective barriers against unwanted influences. Instead of permanent, interdimensional colonization, it facilitated diplomatic contact between independent conscious entities. The key difference was consent. The circle's method forced interdimensional contact whether humans wanted it or not, while the third path required deliberate cooperation from both sides of the dimensional boundary. As this understanding crystallized in my mind, I felt the wise one's presence grow stronger while the hostile entities began to lose their grip on the communication channel. The carved symbols on the tunnel ceiling began to change, with the circle's aggressive modifications being replaced by protective designs that matched those in Whitmore's original seals. But the process was demanding a tremendous amount of energy, and I could feel my physical strength being drained by the effort of maintaining the communication bridge while under psychic attack. Sarah was monitoring my vital signs and providing warnings about dangerous changes in my condition. But I couldn't break the connection until the seal activation was complete. The sounds from above were reaching crescendo. The circles chanting had become frantic. Their equipment was emitting high-pitched whines that suggested overload conditions, and the manifestation sounds were taking on desperate, angry qualities. They're losing control of their summoning, Sarah reported. The entities they were trying to contact are being blocked by the third path interference. But that's making them more aggressive. They're trying to break through by force rather than through the established protocols. I could feel the truth of her observations through my connection to the communication network. The hostile entities were no longer content to work through human proxies. They were making direct attempts to tear through dimensional barriers and establish physical presence in our world, but the wise ones were ready for such attempts. Their response was swift and decisive, using the third path network to reinforce the barriers and redirect the hostile energy into harmless dissipation channels. The tunnel around us began to glow with golden light as Whitmore's seal fully activated, creating a protective zone that extended throughout the drainage system and up into the building above. I could hear the circle's equipment shutting down as their modified symbols lost power and reverted to inactive states. The ninth seal was secure, but we still had 4 locations remaining, and the confrontation had cost us precious time and energy. The new moon alignment was only 5 hours away, and the circle would undoubtedly be regrouping for another attempt at implementing their plans. "Can you continue?" Sarah asked as I removed my hand from the seal and tried to recover from the psychic strain of the communication session. "I have to," I replied, though I could feel the toll the process was taking on my physical and mental resources. Each seal activation was more demanding than the last, and I wasn't sure I had the stamina to complete the full network before the deadline. "The wise ones can provide more direct assistance now," Sarah observed, studying her instruments. "The network is approaching critical mass once we activate to more locations. They'll be able to take on more of the energy burden themselves." We made our way back through the tunnel system, heading toward the 10th seal location at the witch house. But as we traveled, I became aware that we were no longer alone in the underground passages. Footsteps echoed behind us, matching our pace but remaining just beyond the range of our flashlights. When we stopped to listen, the footsteps stopped as well. When we resumed walking, they resumed as well. "Circle operatives?" I asked quietly. Sarah checked her energy detection equipment, frowning at the readings. "I'm not sure. The signatures don't match what we've seen from their people, but they don't match the wise ones either. Something else is down here with us. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear additional sounds, whispered conversations in languages I didn't recognize. Mechanical clicking that might have been equipment or might have been something organic, and a low humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. We need to reach the surface, Sarah said urgently. Whatever's following us doesn't belong in this dimension, and the tunnel system is too isolated to provide adequate protection. We began moving faster, following the route toward the nearest exit, while the sounds behind us grew more numerous and more distinct. It was becoming clear that we weren't dealing with a single pursuer, but with multiple entities that were using the tunnel network to coordinate some kind of flanking maneuver. The exit we were heading for was blocked by a heavy metal grate that should have been unlocked, but was now secured with chains and padlocks that hadn't been there when we'd entered the system. As I worked to find an alternative route on Whitmore's map, the pursuing entities began to close the distance between us in the light of our flashlights. I caught my first clear glimpse of what was following us. They looked human at first glance, but the proportions were wrong to tall, with limbs that were too long and faces that were too symmetrical. Their clothing appeared normal from a distance, but revealed itself to be made from materials that shifted and flowed like liquid metal. Dimensional scouts, Sarah identified grimly. The circle's summoning attempt failed, but it opened temporary breach points that these entities are using to establish reconnaissance presence in our world. How many of them? At least a dozen. Possibly more. And they're not just observing, they're actively trying to disrupt our communication with the wise ones. I could feel the truth of her statement through the third path network. The scouts were emitting some kind of psychic interference that was making it increasingly difficult to maintain contact with the otherworldly allies. If they succeeded in cutting off our communication entirely, we wouldn't be able to complete the remaining seal activations. Is there any way to drive them off? The protective barriers aren't fully operational yet. We don't have enough network nodes active to generate effective countermeasures. But the wise ones might be able to provide temporary assistance if we can get to a location where the connection is stronger. I consulted the map, looking for the nearest activated seal that might provide sanctuary. The closest was the cemetery, the location where Sarah had first introduced me to the third path, about 6 blocks away through surface streets that might or might not be under circle surveillance. How do we get out of here? Sarah pointed to a maintenance ladder that led up to what appeared to be a basement-level access hatch that should put us in the sub-basement of the courthouse. From there, we can reach street level and make our way to the cemetery. The dimensional scouts were close enough now that I could see the details of their alien features. Their eyes reflected the flashlight beams with an unnatural intensity, and their movements had a fluid, predatory quality that suggested they were preparing to attack. We climbed the ladder as quickly as possible, emerging into a basement storage area filled with legal documents and office equipment. The courthouse was closed for the evening, but the security systems were active, and I could hear alarms beginning to sound as motion detectors registered our presence. This is going to bring unwanted attention, I warned as we searched for stairs leading to the upper levels. Better human attention than whatever those scouts were planning to do to us, Sarah replied. At least the police can't follow us into interdimensional space if we need to make an emergency retreat. We reached the ground floor just as Salem. Police units were arriving in response to the security alarms. But instead of attempting to detain us, the officers seemed more interested in the unusual disturbances their equipment was detecting in the courthouse basement. What the hell is going on down there? one officer asked his partner as they studied readings from what looked like electromagnetic detection equipment. Radiation levels are off the charts, but it's not any kind of radiation we've seen before. Could be some kind of chemical leak, the partner replied, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own explanation. Better call the hazmat team and evacuate the area. Sarah and I slipped out through a side entrance while the police were focused on their instruments. The street outside was filling with emergency vehicles, and I could see curious crowds beginning to gather despite the late hour. The dimensional scouts are affecting local reality, Sarah explained as we walked quickly away from the courthouse. Their presence in our world is causing measurable disturbances in the electromagnetic spectrum and probably other phenomena that human technology can detect even if people don't understand what they're measuring. As we made our way toward the cemetery, I noticed other signs of increasing supernatural activity throughout Salem. Streetlights were flickering in patterns that didn't match normal electrical problems. Car alarms were going off randomly, and several building security systems were activating without apparent cause. More troubling were the reports we could hear on Sarah's police scanner, multiple calls about strange lights and unusual sounds from locations throughout the town, along with several missing person reports from areas that corresponded to Obsidian Circle facilities. They're accelerating their operations, Sarah observed. The failure of their major summoning attempt has forced them to try multiple smaller rituals simultaneously. Is that more dangerous or less dangerous than their original plan? Different kind of dangerous. Instead of one massive dimensional breach that we could potentially contain, they're creating multiple smaller access points that will be much harder to track and close. We reached the old burying point as the town clock was chiming 11 p.m. Only 1 hour remained until the new moon alignment, and we still had 4 seal locations that needed to be activated to complete the third path network. But the cemetery had changed since our visit earlier that day. The temperature was significantly warmer than it should have been, and there was a golden glow emanating from several of the headstones, not just Ephraim's monument, but markers throughout the older sections of the burial ground. The Watchers are manifesting, Sarah said, with obvious relief. They must have sensed the dimensional scouts and are taking defensive positions. Translucent figures were becoming visible among the headstones, men and women in period clothing from various historical eras, all bearing the same expression of determined vigilance I'd seen during my first encounter with Ephraim and his companions. But these weren't the same Watchers I'd met at the forest clearing. This was a much larger group that included people from different time periods and cultural backgrounds. Some wore colonial-era clothing, others dressed in 19th century formal wear, and a few appeared to be from more recent decades. Who are they? I asked. Everyone who's ever volunteered to help maintain Salem's dimensional integrity, Sarah explained. The original Watchers that Ephraim recruited, plus people from later generations who chose to join them after learning about the town's supernatural situation. Ephraim himself materialized near his headstone, looking more solid and present than he had during our previous encounters. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the cemetery despite the ambient noise from emergency vehicles in the surrounding streets. The barriers are failing faster than we anticipated, he said without preamble. The Circle's activities have destabilized the entire network, and their dimensional scouts are preparing the way for a massive incursion. How much time do we have? Minutes, not hours. The new moon alignment begins in 47 minutes, but the Circle isn't waiting for optimal conditions anymore. They're trying to force a breakthrough using brute force rather than precision timing. I looked at Whitmore's map, which was now showing real-time data on supernatural activity throughout Salem. Red warning indicators were appearing at multiple locations, suggesting active summoning attempts at sites we hadn't previously identified as circle facilities. Can we complete the third path network in time to counter their operations? Only if we abandon the sequential activation approach and attempt to bring all remaining seals online simultaneously, Sarah said, studying the same data. But that would require dividing our attention among 4 locations while under active attack from multiple dimensional scouts. Ephraim stepped forward, his translucent form becoming more solid. The Watchers can provide assistance, but only if you're willing to accept the full responsibilities of your role as Bridgewalker. What does that mean exactly? It means permanently joining the network that maintains Salem's dimensional integrity. Not just for the duration of this crisis, but for as long as the town requires protection from otherworldly threats. The implications were clear. He was offering me the same choice that had been presented to every cartographer who had worked with the SEAL network. I could complete the third path implementation, but only by accepting transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. What about the normal life I'd be giving up? Sarah stepped closer, her expression sympathetic but determined. David, after tonight, there won't be any normal life for anyone if we don't succeed. The Circle's activities have attracted attention from entities that view Earth as prime territory for colonization. This isn't just about Salem. Anymore, it's about preventing our entire world from being transformed into something unrecognizable. As if to emphasize her point, the police scanner crackled with a report that made my blood run cold. All units. We have multiple missing persons reports from the downtown area. Witnesses describe people simply vanishing in plain sight, leaving behind clothing and personal belongings. Some kind of mass abduction event in progress. Dimensional harvesting, Ephraim identified grimly. The scouts are collecting human subjects for their superiors to study and replicate. Once they have adequate samples, they'll begin systematic replacement of Salem's population with interdimensional duplicates. I looked around the cemetery at the assembled Watchers, seeing in their faces the weight of centuries of sacrifice and service. They had given up their chance at normal death and whatever came after in order to protect people who would never know they existed. Now I was being asked to make the same choice. If I agree, will I still be me? You'll retain your memories, personality, and essential identity, Sarah assured me. But you'll also gain capabilities and awareness that extend far beyond normal human limitations. You'll be able to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, communicate directly with otherworldly entities, and manipulate the fundamental forces that maintain reality's stability. And the alternative, the Circle succeeds in their goals. Salem becomes a permanent interdimensional gateway, and humanity gradually loses its independence as more and more people are replaced with entities that serve otherworldly agendas. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Whatever personal costs I might have to pay, they were insignificant compared to the consequences of failure. "All right," I said finally. "Tell me what I need to do." Chapter 8. The Bridgewalker. The transformation began immediately. Ephraim and the other Watchers formed a circle around me, their translucent forms becoming more substantial as they channeled energy into the process that would convert me from a normal human into something capable of serving as a permanent bridge between dimensions. The experience was unlike anything I could have imagined. Instead of losing consciousness or experiencing some kind of mystical trance, I remained fully aware while my perception gradually expanded to encompass realities that existed parallel to but separate from the physical world. I could suddenly see Salem as it existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The ordinary town that tourists visited, the historical site where colonial-era events continued to echo through time, the supernatural battlefield where otherworldly entities competed for influence, and the idealized community that could emerge if the third path was successfully implemented. The key to serving as Bridgewalker is maintaining awareness of all dimensional states simultaneously while remaining grounded in your original identity. Ephraim explained as the transformation continued. You must never lose sight of your human perspective, even as you gain access to otherworldly viewpoints. The process was demanding but not painful. Rather than feeling like something was being taken away, it felt like capabilities I'd never known I possessed were being awakened. I could sense the presence of the wise ones throughout Salem's dimensional network, feel the malevolent pressure of the entities the circle was trying to summon, and perceive the delicate balance of forces that kept reality stable in the face of competing supernatural influences. But most importantly, I could see what needed to be done to complete the third path. Network and counter the circle's final offensive. The 4 remaining SEAL locations were all under active assault by dimensional scouts, but the attacks were coordinated in a way that revealed the overall strategy behind the circle's operations. They weren't just trying to prevent us from activating the protective barriers, they were attempting to corrupt the SEALs themselves, converting Ephraim's defensive network into components of their own summoning apparatus. They're trying to hijack the entire system, I realized, my expanded awareness allowing me to perceive the true scope of their plan. If they succeed, they'll be able to use 3 centuries of accumulated defensive energy to power the largest interdimensional breach in human history, which is why we need to complete the network activation before they can fully implement their corruption protocols, Sarah said. She was monitoring the situation through her detection equipment, but I could now see that she was also drawing on capabilities that went far beyond normal human senses. You're not entirely human either, I observed. She smiled, though there was sadness in the expression. I've been preparing for this role my entire life. My family's connection to Ephraim goes deeper than simple heredity. We've been gradually integrating otherworldly capabilities for generations, becoming something that can serve as a stable interface between human and non-human consciousness. The transformation was reaching completion, and I could feel my connection to the third path network becoming fully operational. Through the communication links that the wise ones had established, I was able to simultaneously perceive all 13 SEAL locations and assess their current status. The 9 SEALs we had already activated were stable and fully functional, creating a partial protective barrier that was holding back the worst of the circle's interdimensional intrusions. But the 4 remaining locations were in critical condition, with dimensional scouts and corrupted humans working to convert them from defensive installations into summoning platforms. I can see what needs to be done, I told Sarah and Ephraim, but I can't do it from here. I need to physically visit each location and establish direct contact with the wise ones while under fire from hostile entities. The Watchers can provide escort and defensive support, Ephraim offered, but the actual SEAL activations have to be performed by you personally. No one else can serve as the primary bridge between human and otherworldly consciousness. I looked at my watch, noting that only 23 minutes remained until the new moon alignment. Even with supernatural assistance, reaching for separate locations and completing complex ritual procedures in such a short time frame would push the limits of what was physically possible. Is there any way to accelerate the process? Sarah consulted Whitmore's map, which was now displaying tactical information that hadn't been visible before. The locations form two pairs that are close enough to each other to allow rapid transitions. If we can reach the witch house and complete that activation, we can use the network connection to project to the Peabody Essex Museum location. Similarly, if we can secure the custom house site, we can project to the final location at the wharf project. Temporary dimensional displacement, Ephraim explained. Instead of traveling through physical space, you'll move through the interdimensional network itself. But it's extremely dangerous if something goes wrong during transit. You could end up trapped in the spaces between worlds. The risks were significant, but the alternative was certain failure. The Circle's operations were reaching critical. Momentum and delays would only make their defensive measures more effective. Let's do it. The journey to the witch house took us through streets that were increasingly chaotic as Salem's supernatural crisis reached its peak. Emergency vehicles were positioned throughout the downtown area, their crews unable to understand or effectively respond to phenomena that defied conventional explanation. Civilians were evacuating the area in growing numbers, but some were moving in the wrong direction toward Circle facilities rather than away from them. These people had a vacant, distant expression that suggested they were under some form of otherworldly influence. Dimensional conditioning, Sarah identified as we watched a group of apparently normal residents walking calmly toward a building that was radiating dangerous levels of otherworldly energy. The Circle has been gradually exposing selected individuals to corrupted entities, making them more susceptible to interdimensional control. We reached the witch house to find it surrounded by dimensional scouts that were no longer attempting to maintain human appearance. Their true forms were revealed as something like metallic spiders the size of dogs, with too many legs and sensory organs that tracked movement with predatory precision. But they seemed reluctant to approach the building itself, maintaining a perimeter at a respectful distance from the structure's walls. The original protective wards are still active, I realized, my enhanced perception allowing me to see the defensive barriers that surrounded the historical site. They can't get close enough to corrupt the seal directly, which means we can reach the activation point if we're willing to run through their perimeter, Sarah said, studying the scouts' positioning. But once we're inside, we'll be trapped until the network connection is established. The Watchers had followed us from the cemetery and were now taking positions around the building's perimeter. Even in their translucent state, their presence seemed to intimidate the dimensional scouts, creating openings in their defensive line. Go, Ephraim instructed. We'll hold them back as long as possible. Sarah and I sprinted toward the building's entrance as the Watchers engaged the scouts in what appeared to be some form of psychic combat. The otherworldly entities couldn't physically harm the Watchers, but they could disrupt their ability to maintain coherent manifestation in our dimension. We reached the witch house's front door just as several scouts broke through the Watchers' defensive line and began pursuing us. But the moment we crossed the building's threshold, the scouts stopped as if they had encountered an invisible barrier. The interior of the witch house was much larger than it appeared from outside, with additional rooms and levels that existed in dimensional space rather than physical reality. Sarah led me through passages that shifted and changed as we moved, following routes that were marked on Whitmore's map but not on any conventional building plan. we reached the seal location, in what appeared to be a basement chamber that definitely didn't exist in the building's normal architecture. The walls were covered with symbols that combined Ephraim's cartographic techniques with what looked like much older protective designs. "This is where it all started," Sarah explained as I approached the central seal. "The first recorded instance of deliberate interdimensional contact in colonial America. Ephraim used this location as a laboratory for developing the techniques that would eventually become the third path." I placed my hand on the seal and immediately felt the familiar warmth of connection with the Wise Ones. But this time, the communication was enhanced by my new capabilities as Bridgewalker, allowing much more complex and detailed exchange of information. The Wise Ones showed me the true history of Salem's supernatural development, not just the colonial era events, but a much longer timeline that stretched back thousands of years. The area had been a natural crossing point between dimensions long before human settlement, recognized and carefully managed by indigenous peoples who had developed sophisticated protocols for beneficial interdimensional contact. The arrival of European colonists had disrupted these traditional safeguards, creating opportunities for malevolent entities to establish influence through people who lacked the cultural knowledge needed to distinguish between helpful and harmful otherworldly beings. The witch trials had been the climax of this supernatural infiltration, with corrupted individuals using accusations of witchcraft to eliminate people who might have exposed their true activities. But the trials had also generated enough psychic trauma to tear large holes in the dimensional barriers, creating the crisis that Ephraim had spent his life trying to resolve. As this historical understanding settled into my consciousness, the seal began to respond to my presence. The symbols on the chamber walls started glowing with golden light, and I could feel energy flowing through the third path network as the 10th location came online. But the activation also triggered a violent response from the circle's operations. Through my network connection, I could see dimensional scouts converging on our location from multiple directions, while corrupted humans began attempting to breach the building's protective barriers. "We need to move to the next location immediately," Sarah urged. "The circle is realizing that we're close to completing the network, and they're abandoning their other operations to concentrate on stopping us." I completed the seal activation and immediately attempted the dimensional projection technique that Sarah had described. Instead of walking back through the building's conventional exits, I focused on the network connection to the Peabody Essex Museum location and tried to transfer my consciousness directly through interdimensional space. The experience was disorienting beyond description. Instead of moving through normal three-dimensional space, I found myself traveling through regions where geometry worked differently and where distance was measured in conceptual rather than physical terms. I could see Salem spread out below me, like a living map, with lines of force connecting the various seal locations and streams of otherworldly energy flowing between dimensions. The city existed as multiple overlapping realities, each one slightly different from the others, but all connected by the network of interdimensional gateways that the Wise Ones and the Circle were competing to control. The projection delivered me to the museum's basement level, where the 11th seal was located in a storage room filled with artifacts from Salem's maritime history. Sarah materialized beside me moments later, her own dimensional projection apparently successful despite the growing interference from Circle operations. But we weren't alone in the museum. Circle operatives were already present, working to corrupt the seal using techniques that combined high technology with otherworldly knowledge. They had set up equipment that looked like a cross between advanced electronics and arcane ritual, implements, and the air around the seal location was crackling with dangerous energy. "Dr. Ashford," said a familiar voice as Dr. Blackwood stepped out of the shadows. "I had hoped you would reconsider our offer before forcing this confrontation." He was no longer attempting to maintain the appearance of a respectable academic. His clothing had been replaced by robes that seemed to be made from liquid shadow, and his eyes reflected an unnatural intelligence that suggested he was no longer entirely human. "The time for negotiation has passed," he continued. "The alignment is beginning and our preparations are complete. You can either join us voluntarily or watch as we implement our plans, regardless of your preferences." Behind him, other circle members were visibly, all of them, showing signs of otherworldly transformation that suggested they had already begun the conversion process they wanted to impose on the rest of Salem's population. "You're not really offering humanity access to otherworldly knowledge," I realized. "You're serving as advance agents for entities that want to replace human consciousness with something more compatible with their agenda." Dr. Blackwood smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too numerous to be entirely human. "Humanity, as it currently exists, is a temporary evolutionary phase. We're offering acceleration toward a more advanced state of being by destroying everything that makes us human, by eliminating the limitations that prevent us from achieving our full potential." The philosophical disagreement had reached the point where further discussion was pointless. Dr. Blackwood and his colleagues had committed themselves so completely to otherworldly transformation that they were no longer capable of understanding perspectives based on human values and priorities. But they were also standing between me and the seal location, and time was running out for completion of the third path network. "Sarah, can you distract them while I activate the seal?" "I can do better than that," she replied, pulling out a device that looked like a modified radio transmitter. "I can disrupt their equipment long enough for you to complete the activation." She triggered the device, and immediately the circle's technological apparatus began malfunctioning. Sparks flew from their electronic components, otherworldly energy patterns collapsed into chaos, and several of their interdimensional communication links went offline. But Dr. Blackwood and his companions weren't dependent on technology for their otherworldly capabilities. They began advancing toward us with movements that defied normal human physiology, their transformed bodies allowing them to navigate three-dimensional space in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I reached the seal location and placed my hand on the central symbol, initiating contact with the Wise Ones while under direct physical threat from the circle operatives. The communication was immediately disrupted by psychic interference from the transformed humans, making it difficult to maintain the focused attention needed for seal activation. Through the fragmentary connection, I could sense the Wise Ones' growing urgency. The new moon alignment was reaching its peak, creating optimal conditions for the circle's summoning operations. If the third path network wasn't completed within the next few minutes, the window of opportunity would close for another lunar cycle. But the circle wouldn't wait another month to implement their plans. They would use the current alignment to force a breakthrough, regardless of the consequences for Salem's population or the stability of local reality. I pushed harder against the psychic interference, drawing on my new capabilities as Bridgewalker to maintain communication despite the hostile environment. The seal began to respond, its symbols starting to glow with the familiar golden light that indicated successful activation. But Dr. Blackwood was now close enough to physically interfere with the process. His transformed hands reached for my arm, intending to break the connection between me and the Wise Ones before the activation could be completed. That's when Sarah revealed the full extent of her own otherworldly capabilities. Her human appearance fell away like a discarded disguise, revealing something that was both more and less than human. Her true form was composed of living light that could take physical shape when needed, and her consciousness extended across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. "I'm not Margaret's great niece," she said as she interposed herself between me and the Circle operatives. "I'm one of the wise ones who volunteered to take human form in order to guide the Third Path implementation process." Her revelation explained much about her extensive knowledge and unusual capabilities, but it also meant that I had been working with otherworldly allies from the beginning, raising questions about how much of my involvement had been guided by forces beyond my understanding. The transformed Sarah engaged Dr. Blackwood and his companions in combat that operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously. Physical force, psychic pressure, and manipulation of reality's fundamental structure all played roles in the conflict, creating effects that were visible but not entirely comprehensible to normal human perception. Meanwhile, I focused on completing the seal activation despite the chaos around me. The connection with the Wise Ones was growing stronger as the network approached completion, allowing more detailed communication about the final phases of the process. The 11th seal came online just as the town clock began chiming midnight, marking the peak of the new moon alignment. 2 locations remained, but the dimensional projection to the custom house location would be much more dangerous now that the Circle was actively trying to intercept interdimensional travelers. "Can you maintain your current form long enough to escort me to the next location?" I asked Sarah as she concluded her engagement with the Circle operatives. They weren't dead beings, as transformed as Dr. Blackwood couldn't be killed by conventional means, but they had been sufficiently disrupted to prevent immediate pursuit. "I'll try," she replied, her form flickering between human appearance and living light. But each dimensional projection becomes more difficult as the alignment reaches its peak. The spaces between worlds are becoming unstable. We initiated the projection to the custom house location, but the journey through interdimensional space was far more turbulent than the previous transfer. Instead of the relatively smooth transition I'd experienced before, we found ourselves caught in what felt like a supernatural storm, buffered by conflicting forces that threatened to scatter our consciousness across multiple realities. Through the chaos, I could see other travelers moving through the dimensional space's Circle operatives, who were using their own projection techniques to reach the remaining seal locations ahead of us. The race to control Salem's supernatural infrastructure was now being fought in the spaces between worlds as well as in physical reality. We arrived at the custom house to find it already under siege by both dimensional scouts and transformed humans. But the building's historical significance provided some protection, as a site where colonial-era trade with otherworldly entities had first been documented. It retained defensive barriers that were older and more sophisticated than anything the modern Circle could overcome quickly. The 12th seal was located in the building's basement, in a chamber that had been used for storing goods that couldn't be explained through conventional trade relationships. According to historical records, Salem merchants had occasionally received shipments that contained items from places that didn't exist on any earthly map. The seal activation proceeded more smoothly than the previous location, partly because the Wise Ones were now able to provide more direct assistance through the nearly complete network. As the 12th location came online, I could feel the protective barriers around Salem reaching critical strength, creating a level of dimensional stability that hadn't existed since before the colonial period. But one location remained, and it was the most important of all. The 13th seal was positioned at the wharf where Salem's maritime trade had begun, the point where otherworldly goods had first entered the local economy and where the initial contact between European colonists and entities had taken place. It was also where the Circle was concentrating the bulk of their remaining resources for a final attempt at implementing their summoning apparatus. The dimensional projection to the wharf location was the most dangerous, yet taking us through regions of interdimensional space that were actively contested by hostile entities. But we arrived to find an unexpected situation. The area around the final seal was protected not by historical barriers or Wise One's intervention, but by the assembled spirits of everyone who had died in Salem during the witch trials. 20 people had been executed, and many more had died in prison while awaiting trial. But their consciousness had never moved on to whatever came after death. They had remained in Salem, waiting for justice and recognition that their deaths had been the result of deliberate supernatural manipulation rather than legitimate religious prosecution. "We have been watching," spoke a voice that came from all of them simultaneously. "We have seen the truth about what happened to us and why we died. We will not allow the same forces to complete what they began 3 centuries ago." The spirits of the witch trial victims formed a protective barrier around the final seal location, preventing Circle operatives from approaching while I completed the network activation. Their presence was both inspiring and heartbreaking. People who had been denied justice in life were using their continued existence to protect others from suffering the same fate. I placed my hand on the 13th seal and felt the entire third path network come alive with power and purpose. Salem's dimensional infrastructure was now fully operational, creating a stable framework for beneficial interdimensional contact, while maintaining protection against hostile entities and unwanted intrusions. Through the completed network, I could perceive the full scope of what had been accomplished. Salem was no longer at risk of becoming a gateway for otherworldly colonization. Instead, it had become something like what the Abenaki had originally maintained: a carefully managed interface between worlds that allowed beneficial exchange, while preserving the independence and integrity of all participating forms of consciousness. The Circle's summoning operations collapsed as their corrupted apparatus was overridden by the Third Path's protective protocols. The Dimensional Scouts were expelled from our reality, returning to whatever otherworldly realm they had originally inhabited. The transformed Circle members found their otherworldly enhancements neutralized, returning them to normal human status but with memories of their activities intact. Most importantly, the Wise Ones were now able to establish permanent, stable communication with humanity, offering knowledge and assistance without requiring the kind of transformation or sacrifice that previous interdimensional contact attempts had demanded. Epilogue. The new Salem 6 months after the events that the local news had reported as unusual electromagnetic disturbances, Salem had settled into a new equilibrium that seemed normal to casual observers, but was actually far more complex and interesting than most people realized. The town continued to attract tourists interested in its historical significance, but it also began drawing researchers, artists, and thinkers who were drawn to what they described as Salem's unique intellectual atmosphere. Property values rose as people competed to live in a community that seemed to generate unusual numbers of breakthrough discoveries and creative innovations. What the new residents didn't consciously recognize was that they were benefiting from subtle influences provided by the Wise Ones through the Third Path network. Problems that had previously seemed intractable became manageable. Research that had been stalled for years suddenly showed promising results. Artists found themselves able to access inspiration and techniques that elevated their work to new levels. It was the kind of beneficial, interdimensional exchange that Ephraim Whitmore had originally envisioned. Otherworldly assistance that enhanced human capabilities without compromising human independence or identity. The Obsidian Circle had been quietly disbanded, its members either choosing to cooperate with the Third Path protocols or relocating to communities where their activities wouldn't threaten dimensional stability. Dr. Blackwood had accepted a position at a small college in Vermont, where he was using his extensive knowledge of otherworldly phenomena to contribute to legitimate academic research rather than dangerous experimentation. By Margaret Blackthorne had been restored to life through the combined efforts of the Wise Ones and the Watchers, though she now existed in a state similar to Sarah's, partially human and partially otherworldly, serving as a bridge between different forms of consciousness. She had reopened her historical research consultancy and was working to document the true history of Salem's supernatural development. The Watchers continued their protective duties, but with a much lighter burden than they had carried for centuries. The Third Path network was largely self-maintaining, requiring their intervention only during unusual circumstances, or when new types of otherworldly entities attempted to test Salem's defenses. As for me, I had discovered that serving as bridge Walker was far more interesting and fulfilling than I had expected. Instead of being trapped in Salem, I was able to travel freely, consulting on interdimensional phenomena at other locations around the world where similar networks were being established. The Third Path was expanding beyond Salem, with communities in dozens of countries developing their own versions of the system. Each network was adapted to local conditions and cultural preferences, but all were connected through the interdimensional communication channels that the Wise Ones maintained. It was, I realized, the beginning of a new phase of human development. The wholesale transformation that the Circle had sought to impose, but a gradual, voluntary expansion of human capabilities through beneficial partnership with otherworldly allies. I kept Ephraim Whitmore's original map, though it had evolved far beyond its original form. It now showed not just Salem's supernatural geography, but the growing network of Third Path locations around the world and the interdimensional territories where the Wise Ones and their allies maintained their own communities. Sometimes, late at night when I was working in my restored shop in Boston, I would spread out the map and study the patterns of connection that linked human and otherworldly consciousness across multiple dimensions. The future it revealed was more complex and challenging than anything previous generations had imagined. But it was also full of possibilities that had never existed before. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, but we hadn't lost our essential humanity in the process of discovering our otherworldly neighbors. Instead, we had learned to be more fully human while also becoming something greater than we had been before. And in Salem, where it all began, the ancient trees continued to grow, the harbor continued to welcome ships from distant shores, and the boundaries between worlds remained open to those who approached them with wisdom, courage, and respect for the consciousness that dwelt on both sides of the dimensional divide. The cartographer's curse had become the cartographer's gift, transforming what had once been a burden into an opportunity for growth and discovery that would benefit not just Salem, but all of humanity as we stepped forward into a larger and more wondrous universe than we had ever dared to imagine.